There is a manuscript that does not exist. It would have been roughly 200 pages, handwritten in the careful cursive that women of her generation were taught before typewriters made penmanship a secondary concern, covering the years between 1871 and 1943 in the specific and unrepeatable detail that only a person who lived through every one of those years without interruption could have produced. It would have described the interior of a world that no photograph captured and no official record preserved, the texture of daily life in a rural Tennessee community before electrification, before the automobile changed the geography of ordinary movement, before 2 world wars restructured what Americans understood themselves to be, and what they were willing to say out loud about what they remembered. The woman who would have written it was named Delphia Burns Carroll. She was born in 1871 in Overton County, Tennessee, survived into her early 70s, and spent the last decade of her life telling the people around her that she needed to write it all down before it was gone. She never did, not because she ran out of time exactly, but because every time she came close to starting, something intervened: family obligation, illness, the practical weight of a life that did not pause to allow for memoir. And then in 1943 she died of pneumonia at 72, with the manuscript unwritten and the memory unrecorded, and the world she had carried inside her gone with her into the ground. Delphia Carroll is not famous. She does not appear in any history book, and her name does not come up in searches of Tennessee historical records unless you know specifically where to look, which almost nobody does, because the records that document her existence are the ordinary records of an ordinary life: a birth registration, a marriage certificate, census entries in 1880 and 1900 and 1910 and 1920, a death certificate, a grave marker in a church cemetery outside Livingston, Tennessee, that her descendants have maintained but that receives no visitors who did not already know her name. What makes her significant is not what she did, it is what she knew and what the loss of that knowledge represents in the larger context of how the world before 1900 has been remembered, recorded, and in many cases systematically not recorded by the institutions that were supposed to be doing the recording. The period between 1870 and 1900 in rural America is one of the least documented stretches of ordinary life in the country's history. Not because nothing was happening. The opposite is true. It was a period of transformation so rapid and so total that the people living through it frequently described feeling that the world was changing faster than language could follow. But because the documentation infrastructure that would later capture ordinary life in granular detail did not yet exist, the photograph was present but expensive and formal, producing images of posed subjects in studio settings rather than the casual documentation of daily existence that became possible with cheaper cameras in the early 20th century. The interview as a historical preservation method did not exist in any systematic form. The oral history movement that would eventually send researchers into communities to record the memories of elderly residents before those residents died did not begin in earnest until the 1930s. And by then, the people who had been adults before 1900 were already old, already diminished in number, already carrying memories that had softened at the edges the way all memories do when enough decades pass over them. Delphia Carroll was 39 years old when the oral history movement was still decades away from reaching her county. She was 72 when she died. The window closed and nobody was standing in it. What Delphia Carroll remembered, reconstructed through the accounts of her children and grandchildren who were interviewed by a local historian named Margaret Sells in the late 1970s, was a version of rural Tennessee life that the standard historical record of the period does not capture in any comprehensive way. She remembered the specific economics of a subsistence farming community that operated almost entirely outside the cash economy. Families who measured wealth in stored food and working animals, and the labor obligations neighbors owed each other, who went months at a time without handling money in any form, who understood credit not as a bank transaction, but as a web of mutual obligation that ran through the community and was enforced entirely by social memory and reputation. She remembered the medical culture of the period, which in rural Overton County in the 1880s meant a combination of herbal knowledge passed through female family lines, the occasional visit of a traveling physician whose training varied enormously and whose interventions were as likely to harm as to help, and a practical understanding of which conditions the community could manage and which ones it could not. She remembered the religious life of the community in a specificity that the formal church records do not preserve, the distinction between official doctrine and actual practice, the syncretism between Protestant Christianity and older folk traditions that the clergy discouraged but could not eliminate, the way belief and superstition and practical knowledge about the natural world were not experienced as separate categories by the people living inside that culture. Margaret Sells conducted her interviews between 1978 and 1981 and produced a typescript of roughly 60 pages that she deposited with the Overton County Historical Society. The typescript is there in a filing cabinet largely unread because the Overton County Historical Society does not have the staff or the resources to process, digitize, and make accessible the materials in its collection at any scale. Sells herself died in 1994 without having published the interviews or the analysis she had planned to write from them. Her research notes are in the same filing cabinet. What the Carroll family told Sells about what Delphia remembered represents a third-order reconstruction. Delphia's memories, as recalled by her children and grandchildren decades after she died, as recorded by a local historian who did not have the methodological training of an academic oral historian, as preserved in a typescript that has not been read carefully by anyone in over 20 years. Each step in that chain introduced distortion. What arrived at the filing cabinet is real evidence of something, but it is evidence that has been processed through multiple filters, and the original, Delphia's unmediated memory of the world before 1900, is simply not recoverable. The loss that Delphia Carroll represents is not unique to her or to Overton County. It is the standard condition of the historical record for ordinary rural American life before 1900, and it has a specific shape that matters for understanding why the period is so poorly documented relative to its historical significance. The people who lived through the transformation of American life between 1870 and 1900, the industrialization, the closing of the frontier, the mass immigration, the technological changes that restructured daily existence, were overwhelmingly not the people whose experiences the documentation infrastructure of the era was designed to capture. The documentation captured the extraordinary, the famous, the wealthy, the institutionally connected, the people who generated paper by transacting with bureaucracies and courts and newspapers. It did not capture the ordinary, and the ordinary is where most people lived, and where the texture of the world before 1900 actually resided. The oral history movement that arrived too late for Delphia Carroll did eventually reach communities like hers, and the work it produced in the 1930s and 1940s under the Federal Writers Project and the Works Progress Administration represents the most significant systematic attempt ever made to document ordinary American life before the people who remembered it were gone. The Federal Writers Project sent interviewers into communities across the country between 1936 and 1940 and collected accounts from elderly Americans covering the period before 1900 with a scope and geographic reach that no private effort could have matched. The collection includes approximately 10,000 interviews covering subjects from formerly enslaved people describing life before and during the Civil War to rural community members describing farming practices, folk medicine, religious life, and the specific texture of daily existence in the decades before electrification and mass communication changed everything. The collection is housed at the Library of Congress. Large portions of it have been digitized. It is one of the most valuable historical archives in the country, and is used regularly by researchers, genealogists, and historians working on the period. It also has gaps that the people who created it understood in real time and could not close. The interviewers were constrained by geography, by budget, by the political pressures of the New Deal era that shaped what kinds of communities received attention and what kinds did not. Rural Tennessee was not systematically covered. Overton County does not appear in the Federal Writers Project collection in any substantial way. The communities that were covered were not always covered by interviewers who had the training or the time to capture what the people they were talking to actually knew, as opposed to what the interview format they were using was designed to elicit. And by 1936, the people who had been adults before 1900 were already in their 60s and 70s at minimum, carrying memories that were genuine but that had been living inside aging minds for 30 and 40 years since the events they described. Delphia Carroll was 65 in 1936. She was alive during the entire run of the Federal Writers Project. No one came to Overton County to talk to her. The manuscript that doesn't exist would have covered the years between 1871 and 1943 from the inside of a life that was ordinary in every way that the historical record considers unremarkable and extraordinary in every way that actually matters for understanding what the world was like before the 20th century restructured it. It would have described things that no document preserves and no photograph captured. The smell of a wood stove in a house with no insulation in January. The specific social choreography of a community that regulated its own behavior entirely through mutual observation because there was no other mechanism available. The knowledge about plants and weather and the behavior of animals that accumulated over generations of people paying close attention to the same piece of ground. What it felt like to be alive in a world where the horizon was the limit of your practical geography, and the people within walking distance were the entirety of your social world. That world ended. Delphia Carroll was one of the last people alive who remembered it from the inside, and she ran out of time before she could write it down. If something in this video stayed with you, the filing cabinet in Overton County, the Federal Writers Project that never reached her, the manuscript described in the first sentence that will never exist, tell us in the comments what it was. Not a general thought, the specific thing that landed. And if your own family has someone like Delphia, a person whose memories died with them, a story that almost got written down, a world that ended when someone did, share it here. That is exactly the kind of history this community was built to hold. We read every thread. Subscribe if you want to be here when we keep going. There is more where this came from, and we are not slowing down.